welcome to this IPPR event on what is the policy agenda to break the blue wall. I'm Carys Roberts and I'm Executive Director here at IPPR, and it's my pleasure to introduce you. I've been really looking forward to this event, and we've heard lots about the changing electoral fortunes of the Liberal Democrats in recent by-elections and local elections and so on. But as policy wonks at the think tank IPPR, we want to know what the policy agenda is that's going to make that happen. And so we've got a fantastic set of speakers with us today. We have Mark Pack, who is President of the Liberal Democrats and Editor of the Liberal Democrat Newswire, and has held pretty much just about every position in the Liberal Democrat world that my colleagues could put into the bio. So I'm not going to read out all of them, but a very warm welcome to you, Mark. We also have Miranda Green, who is Deputy Opinion Editor at the Financial Times, and I believe in the 1990s worked for the Liberal Democrats. And so very warm welcome to you, Miranda. And we have Dr Tom Lubbock, who is founder partner of J.L partner, a public opinion research company, and a former pulpit at TCHQ. So very warm welcome to you as well. So I've asked each of our speakers to consider several key questions, including what does the future hold for Liberal Democrats, especially in the next general election? What are the key policy areas that the party sees as vote winners? Which demographic groups do the party need to appeal to, and how does that come together in an electoral coalition? So no full questions there. I'm hoping we can get into remarks from the panel, and then we're going to open up to the audience, and there's a lot of you. So do be thinking of your questions, but please also keep them brief. So Mark's going to keep it brief. One note just to say, we did think that Ed Davey was going to join, and if you saw that in the listing, I'm afraid he isn't going to join because I hear he's got lots of other things to be getting on with. But we'll have a really great discussion anyway. So with no further ado, over to you, Mark.
Thank you, and it's great to see think tanks, high quality newspapers, and pollsters engaging so much more with the Liberal Democrats once again. So thank you for the invite. And I thought I could give the boring answer to the question of reciting the top policies from the latest template issued by Dave McCulloch and the campaigns team, which would keep the press office happy with me, but might not be so interesting. So I thought I'll try to go for a more interesting way of answering some of those questions, which is to think about what the role of policy is in election campaigns specifically, because there are lots of roles for policy in politics, for getting governing right, for being prepared in case you find yourself in power, for being able to answer questions from the public consistently and clearly, and others. But for winning votes specifically, I think the role of policy is often misunderstood. People often talk about policy as if it's the plot when it's really the props. And let me explain that, because there's an idealized version of politics where people sit down with all the manifestos side by side, they go through every page, they mark them up. We all do that, we know, we all do that, but not quite everyone else does that. Reality is that most of the public don't pay that much attention to politics. To give you just one polling example for a different polling firm, I apologise, but halfway through the 2017 general election campaign, 8 in 10 people could not name any Tory election slogan. So what matters for winning votes is competence and empathy. Can you lot get things done? And do you lot understand people like me? Those are the questions in the public's mind. And that was true even with Boris Johnson, who I will concede is not an obvious poster boy for the role of competence in winning elections. But that was his dishonest pitch in 2019, that he understood that people were fed up with endless talk about Brexit and that he could get it done. Whilst he was able to pull off persuading people of that combination, he did remarkably frustratingly well in the election. Now, when reality, of course, caught up with him, but it shows that point about how important empathy and competence is, which is why the role for policy is as illustrations, as props to illustrate the empathy and to illustrate the competence. It's the props rather than the plot itself. So for the Lib Dems, what I think that means works best for our policy agenda, and indeed is working best looking at things like our parliamentary by-election results, is one that focuses on the top concerns of people, such as the cost of living and the NHS in particular, and provides credible, tangible examples of how we can make people's lives better. It's why, for example, there is so much to fix on the NHS, but focusing in on making it easier and quicker for people to get GP appointments shows that we understand the stress that people are under, shows that we understand the huge frustrations and disruptions it causes finding it so hard to find a GP appointment, and shows that we have a credible solution to meeting those challenges. So that's why policy that shows competence and shows empathy is the route to winning elections. Thank you.
Miranda, I'd like to turn to you. You're open on that.
Okay, would you all like me to stand up? Is that better? Yeah, okay. So to start with, thank you very much for the invitation. I was delighted to go to a talk by a Lib Dem MP last night in which she was talking about the importance of the print media, and I thought, well, this is absolutely fantastic. She kept going on and on about the importance of the print media. I thought I'd come to the right place, and then she meant focus leaflets. There we go. Anyway, what should you put on your print media? Seems to be the theme of tonight. So in that same talk, it was very clear that a lot of lessons have been learnt from 3 very disappointing election nights, I think it's fair to say, Mark. Not just in terms of sort of ruthless seat targeting this time around, but also about the message. And, you know, if this message has got through to the party, speak to people about their own concerns, rather than the self-selected concerns of the Liberal Democrat Party, and that is also very healthy. However, the list, you know, as repeated, was fairly obvious. It was cost of living, health, as you've explained, Mark, and thirdly, sewage, which is obviously a huge issue in lots of local areas. And I'd like to focus on the sewage one because, not because of any unhealthy obsession on my part, but because it seems to me to be a brilliant example of complaining about something that's gone wrong with British infrastructure, the structure of British capitalism, the way the people in charge have given presents to their mates to the cost of everyone else's environment, and indeed the public's pocket when you look at the dividends, etc. And I think this is sort of really interesting. I think that sewage issue is really interesting that it's one of the top 3 that this MP was quoting, and they're right, because of this idea of a policy that isn't just about that particular policy, it's what it tells you about the values of the party and what their ambitions might be should they get a chance to have their hands on the levers of power. And that's really, I think, the holy grail for any political party. I'm not quite sure what they are at the moment for the Lib Dems. I would say the sort of uber example of that perfect policy that captures something as well as being a serious intent was Labour's pledge to introduce a national minimum wage back in the 1997 election, because it's real, it'll make a difference, and it also shows you something about the kind of whole project that you want to have in government. So I'm interested in whether Mark thinks there are any things, you know, in the Liberal Democrat policy prospectus that can do that job of conveying the values, as well as you know, I'm not sure sort of having more dentists quite cuts it, although I totally understand how in particular seats that's kind of how you get across an NHS message. So I think that's the thing. And I think there's a huge opportunity here for the Lib Dems, because the current government is so good at finding the inverse of that miraculous Labour policy proposal. I mean, just one example from the last few days alone, Rishi Sunak sort of having a brainstorm and saying, well, why don't we fine patients for not turning up to their medical appointments in the NHS, which of course anyone who's had any experience of the NHS knows this is an absolute farce, because you know, the letters come after the appointment, you get 3 letters with appointments on different days, etc., etc. All the reasons why that wouldn't work, and it's punishing the public. So I think there's a great opportunity here, and I'm keeping it very short, to find some policies that encapsulate something about values and intention and ambition beyond the policy itself. And I think the problem slightly with the attitude the party's taken, which is we're going to have 40 or so by-election campaigns in a general election, is can you find some unifying national messages around policy that take it that bit further and actually make people think, okay, that's the kind of country I want to live in, and these people have got some great ideas to build that country I want to live in. And I get why, you know, find a GP appointment is important, but I think a little more work needs to be done on that. I'm going to shut up now because we've got so much to get through.
Thank you very much, Miranda, and finally over to you, Tom.
Thanks so much. I think I drew the short straw following Mark and Miranda because they've hit the nail on the head. But I'm going to take the baton that Mark has handed me and run with it. So I think there are two things you missed, Mark, that I think are really important when it comes to policy. The one is to use policy, and all this does is prove I read the Sunday papers, right? Use your policy to introduce your leader, because your leader is the most important thing when it comes to a general election. That is the #1 predictor of how people will vote in a general election, is how they perceive the leaders of the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, but also of the Liberal Democrats. So you use your policy and to introduce your leader. And the reason I say talk about the Sunday papers is I literally couldn't find an article in the Telegraph that didn't start with the words Rishi Sunak has done this, Rishi Sunak has done that, and all the big decisions have been made by Rishi Sunak. And so what you saw over the weekend was an exercise in introducing Rishi Sunak, trying to reintroduce himself to voters using, as Mark says, these policies as props in a kind of non-pejorative way. I mean, they may be good props, they may be wonderful policies, but it's a vehicle to introduce the leader to the public. And so I had a quick look at the polling before I came here this evening, and I reckon, just eyeballing 3 or 4 polls that have taken place this year, I reckon it's safe to say about half of people know who a Davey is, half of the public. So you can look at that 2 ways. Either you can say half of people know who he is, but you could say, well, half of people don't know who he is. But you've got that job of introducing the other half of the public to Ed Davey, assuming you want them to vote for you and you want them to think something about him. And policy is one way to do that. And then the other thing, which I think often gets lost in the debates in the Labour and Conservative parties, because it's such a hard thing to do, is that policy can show that as a party you're on the same page, you're singing from the same hymn sheet, you're unified, and voters love that. They love it when it looks like the party is singing together. Now, there's a tension here. Again, all I did was read the papers at the weekend. There's a tension here because often it's hard to get yourself heard on policy unless you're actually picking a fight with your own party. And I think we've never seen so much coverage of Lib Dem housing policy. Yeah, I know, until the last couple of weeks. So often hard to square that circle, but showing that you're unified to the public is another way of using policy as a prop, as Mark said. I think I'll finish on one final thing, and then I'll talk quickly about Europe and then sit down so that you don't throw things at me. But another consideration on policy is you should keep it very, very simple when it gets to voters. So, and I think this is I'll say this on Europe, and I think I'll get away with it. Unless you've got something very simple to say to voters on Europe, don't say anything, or say as little as you can get away with, because the message that voters want to hear is something straightforward that doesn't confuse them and that leaves them feeling more confident in their own knowledge about politics, in knowing what a party stands for, what the party brand is. And so I don't know what that is, I don't know what you should say on Europe, but if you can't say something simple, then say as little as possible.
Thank you very much. Mark, we've heard there a few kind of additions to your competence and empathy purposes. So conveying values of project, presenting unification of party, presenting a simple message, introducing a leader. What's your response to that? Do you weight those as highly as competence and empathy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about illustrating the leader being valuable role of policy is a really spot on one. And in a way, that's why we talk as much, and Ed is, particularly in his media interviews, talks as much about carers as he does, because it's a really important issue in its own right that touches the lives of millions of people. It's also an issue that really, you know, it's probably the issue that Ed gets most emotionally invested in. You know, he really comes over as a as a person with a backstory that, you know, one almost thinks surely that's just got to be out of fiction, all of the hardships that he and his family have faced over years. And so there's a real sense of this is a decent human being that comes through on that, that's much harder, and with apologies to one of our leading electoral reformers sat in the front row in the party, much harder to do that if you're talking about, say, electoral systems. You know, and so there is a, you know, although we absolutely think that changing Britain's electoral system is crucial for the future of the country, other things being equal, absolutely makes sense for Ed to zoom in on caring, because that's the thing where he can really come over as that empathetic, caring person because of the huge tragedies that he has so impressively, you know, overcome and is battling in his life.
Fantastic, thank you. And then I did want to slightly push our panel on one of the aspects we wanted to discuss, which is the who, and thinking about the electoral coalition that smashing the blue wall would need to win over. And particularly we've talked about kind of which issues are important to people, but there's also the how you get there, and as you were saying, what your kind of values and project that you bring to that would be. So Miranda and Tom, I'd be interested in your reflections on kind of who those people are and how much they care about the how and what that looks like.
So it's really interesting. Sorry, this sounds a bit of a divergence, but I think it's quite important. The blue wall is so named after the red wall. And of course, the red wall is often used in a rather overly loose way to just mean the north. Such a place does exist. But in fact, the blue wall was a very specific description by somebody who looked really closely at Tory seats and had realised there were a whole bunch of seats in the Midlands, West Midlands and the north of England, which looked exactly like the demographics of those safe Tory territories in the south, but for some reason weren't voting Tory. And so it was a question of how can we get those people who ought to be Tory to become Tory? You know, so actually, if you're thinking about the blue wall, I think it's quite important to ask these demographic questions, because it's who is there in these sort of Tory seats across, you know, Oxfordshire, Surrey, Hertfordshire, all the rest of it, that is potentially actually a Lib Dem in their heart of hearts, or at least temporarily a Lib Dem, or maybe Lib Dem curious, or whatever we want to call it. You know, and so that demographic question is really important. And you know, clearly there's a lot of potential there for the sort of, you know, disenfranchised people who say that, you know, that wonderful phrase when people say it's not, you know, the Conservative Party left me, I didn't leave the Conservative Party, it's not the Conservative Party I joined, you know, my values are no longer, you know, visible in the current Conservative Party of today. But also there is this huge, you know, there's this huge background of social change. And, you know, there was a really fascinating presentation this morning, which I advise you all to take a look at, by Rob Ford of Manchester University, about the extent to which the graduate population, i.e. the highly educated, tip naturally towards voting Lib Dem. And of course, as those people, some of them have sort of left London, gone out to commuter belt, you know, as people leave cities to the seats around cities, that changes the kind of balance of voters in those territories. So, you know, you're looking at very promising changes in the landscape in those places, and I think probably the traditional liberal outlook, the internationalism, however soft and whispered the pro-Europeanism has to be now, you know, a bit of that maybe, but you know, that they also feel insecure because of the way the nation's infrastructure is falling apart, the public services are falling apart, the economy doesn't look safe in the Conservatives' hands, etc. But they are sort of naturally tilted towards Lib Dems anyway in some of those areas, which should really help, I think.
Great.
It's a really great question. I've got a really different and quite technical answer, but I think it's really important for you in the blue wall. So The group that we always see who are left voting Labour in Lib Dem Conservative marginals are what we call socioeconomic group DE voters. They tend to be, you know, super low information and quite disengaged from politics. And so part of the problem that you have in blue wall seats is that you have to squeeze that. Obviously, you know this. You have to squeeze the Labour vote, and what tends to be left in these really close contests is people who are on lower incomes or on welfare and benefits. And it's hard to get that message across to them that they need to vote tactically for the Lib Dems to win. And they tend to stick with Labour beyond the point that higher income voters and graduates that Miranda's talked about have switched to voting Lib Dem in those seats. So that would be a group I would focus on. Really hard to reach, but that's, you know, how important squeezing the Labour vote is in these seats. So that's what I would focus on.
There's one very quick follow-up to that, which is just with the boundary changes, that's going to throw up quite a lot of seats, the results of which will now be in the air in a way that they weren't before. How does that play out with the Lib Dems? You looked at that.
Yeah, I don't know what the boundary changes do for the Lib Dems specifically, but we all know that it's probably worth about 12-15 seats for the Conservatives, and I think that probably still holds true. But most of that is going to be at Labour's expense rather than at the Lib Dems' expense.
Great, thank you. So I want to open up to the audience. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions. I'm going to take a few at a time, and Olivia has a mic, but she's just one person, so bear with her as she brings it to you. So I think there are a few hands first at the back there, and the man standing here, Olivia.
So, unfortunately, I am going to ask something quick about Europe after being in another defense on Europeanism. I think the main thing is just say something short and clear on it, like we're saying. I think generally the direction that I'd suggest with regards to saying if someone, not putting the agenda directly, but maybe like an FAQ, if someone directly asks, just maybe have a clearer message saying, okay, if someone says, oh, would you want to rejoin the EU? Just be like, well, ideally it's very like big, but it's a long, it's you know, going to be a long job and a long process. So yeah, just having that as more clear view, I think. So I think at the moment where you try and dodge your question and you try and avoid talk about it, I personally think in a lot of blue wall seats, it does, you know, that kind of wishy-washy response does cost quite a lot of sloppy votes. And another thing, Mark, with regards to victory stunts in blue wall seats, I've got a little sketch of another idea, which I don't know if you want to share it with me at the end. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And there's a hand at the back with the red tie.
Hi there, my name's Samuel, I'm from Collardale. Just to give you an example, my mother, she's very much dyed-in-the-wool Conservative. The only time she's ever voted Lib Dem was for me. Anyway, during the local elections one year, she voted for the Conservative candidate, but because that Conservative candidate supported the reduction of speed limits to 20 miles per hour, my mother, she sent in an email to her saying that because she voted for her, that the candidate, if they were to win, should renege on their promise of reducing speed limits to 20 miles per hour. Now, my main concern is, how do we deal with the potential prospects of people voting for us, not necessarily because of our policies, but because we may constitute a protest vote, and then coming back to us saying, we don't want you to fulfill the promises that you set out at the last election, we only voted for you to get the Tories out. Thank you.
And I'll say Olivia's running around to take one more from the back, and the lady just back there in white.
Oh, yeah. We suffered greatly post the 2010 election because we made a promise which wasn't fulfilled about the student fees. And I just wonder how we avoid making those sort of promises in the future. I think you're right to say about Ed focusing on the carers. And it really depends which bit of the wall you want to attack, because I think we're still quite divided on Europe. I mean, there are parts of the south and south of England that are very, very pro-Europe, but there's still a lot of questions about for the north of England and how do we cope with that. But I think as we need to we don't want to fall into the trap of making promises that we're not able to keep.
Great, thank you. So we'll start with those. Tom, I wonder if I could start with you in terms of that clearer message on the EU and how that would affect the Democrats.
This one on.
It should be me.
I think you've exactly hit the nail on the head in terms of the simple message that it has to be clear, and I think there is room for manoeuvre. I think you know what the clear message is. You know, we don't know at this point, but I think there is room for manoeuvre. I don't think voters will be too surprised whatever the message is, but just I think exactly as you say, I think you could put people off by trying to hedge your bets. We've been talked a lot about hedging bets this week, politicians hedging, and I wouldn't do it.
That's a short and clear message as well. Miranda, do you want to cover that question, or perhaps the broken promises one?
Oh, broken promises. Yeah, we all know what you mean there. It's really tricky, isn't it? I mean, if there is some sort of hung parliament territory after the approaching election, then clearly it's important not to have a manifesto with headline promises that you're going to get in trouble on again. And I would seriously hope that that lesson has been learned in the right way. I kind of get the feeling that everyone's secretly hoping for a comfortable Labour majority, even the Lib Dems, because that's really interesting. Why would you want that? Well, because then there won't be such difficult decisions a second time. Okay, that's really interesting. How many people in this room would actually like to be involved in another coalition?
Oh, no.
Okay, who would prefer a coalition to a Labour majority? Okay, I'm assuming it's with Labour. But this is really interesting, because this does mean that you have to exert considerable discipline in the manifesto process, right? Because you've got to have front page policies that are amenable to negotiation without getting into the mess that you got into last time on tuition fees, which is an entirely predictable mess, by the way. Yeah, okay, well, we can re-legislate that in another meeting, Carys, but anyway, so it is important and it is interesting. And actually also I slightly have a bone to pick with Mark on his earlier remark on manifestos, when he sort of said, well, the voters don't read all the manifestos and go through them with a highlighter pen like saddos like you and I have done that, obviously. I mean, that may be true, but the discipline that's required in putting together a manifesto is a really important process of working out what your prospectus is, what your priorities are, what you could hold to and would insist on in a negotiation, and what you would let go, etc. So we shouldn't knock the manifesto process, even though it's very fashionable to say that they don't matter.
Thank you very much. So Mark, over to you. And there's also that protest vote.
Yeah. So actually, I think the worst bit of that 2010 experience was not tuition fees, but it was the no more broken promises party political broadcast. If you go back and watch it now and think, you know, what we were promising, that we would stick completely to our principles and we would have no more broken promises, and we were doing this just ahead of a polling day, at which we weren't going to get a Lib Dem majority government. It's really hard to see how anyone watching that party political broadcast would have not ended up being grievously disappointed in the party unless we had really flopped and therefore been well away from, you know, having to worry about doing anything in, you know, anything like a hung parliament. And I think there was the fundamental problem in 2010, which was why our support collapsed in the polls immediately after the 2010 election. So before any announcement on tuition fees, before any announcement on bedroom tax, before any announcement on all those issues that people liked mentioning, were angry and shouted at us about on the doorsteps, before any of those had happened, our support had already collapsed. And that was because people felt like we were running against one party and then that we'd got into bed with them. So I think there is a real importance about that clarity, which you will have heard from Ed, you know, in many of his media interviews, about our job at the next election is to play our part in removing the Conservatives from power. And there's a clarity and simplicity to that, which is also helpful in Labour-facing areas, because it gives a reassurance to, you know, to Labour voters that actually they can switch to the Lib Dems, because our pitch is an anti-Tory pitch. And absolutely, of course, we need to, you know, make sure that if that's what we say, that we follow, that's what we believe, and that's the role that we play. But I think that's the answer to the simplicity point. And I would just briefly add, I absolutely agree with you, Miranda, on the importance of a manifesto process as being a way of, as it were, working through what are actually the implications in detail of the sorts of, you know, things that you might have to do to keep your simplicity, your simple promises, when you're actually then faced with the complexity of reality and having to actually act on them.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to take some more questions. I'll take you from the front here, so gentlemen.
Thank you very much, and thank you. And it's not my question, but my mum also cast her first and only vote for the Liberal Democrats because I was a candidate. The sad thing being I was a candidate in Wimbledon and she lived in Preston. But my question does relate to Wimbledon. It also relates to what Tom said about squeeze. But I think some of the difficulties we've seen at conference are over the party's desire to appeal to what it might imagine soft Conservative voters find appealing, and our own knowledge that we have to also squeeze Labour voters. We also have to motivate our own members and supporters as well. And so my question to the panel is, where's the balance there? How do we balance those different categories of voters in our policy and priority position?
Fantastic, thank you. Question at the front.
Thank you. I'm tempted to talk about coalitions, but I won't. I was interested in the comment about socioeconomic groups D&E that Tom raised, and you said they were hard to get at.
Except print media.
I thought about socioeconomic groups. Well, okay. So my question was going to be: does anyone in the panel have an idea of how best to reach the D&E groups? That's one. And following on from that, how important are they going to be in the blue wall seats? And if we're saying they're difficult to shift, surely it was the D&Es that shifted from Labour to Conservative in the red wall seats. So perhaps they're rather more manoeuvrable or mobile than we perhaps have traditionally seen them as being.
Thank you. And the question here, the bus.
I think most of the campaigns that we've run in recent years have been essentially against the Conservatives and have consisted in agreeing with the people we've been canvassing that Conservatives are rubbish. But how do we set about distinguishing ourselves from Labour, as in the mid-beds by-election and presumably as in the forthcoming general election, if we hope to widen our appeal?
Fantastic, thank you. Mark, can I start with you this time?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure what it is about how people are bringing up their sons that they're then all joining and being active in other parties, but whatever it is, thank you to both of your mothers for giving us yourselves as Lib Dems. On the point about anti-conservative messaging, I think for most members of the public, so most people who aren't that interested in politics, don't follow it that closely, it's deeply frustrating, but something we need to acknowledge, that the question basically boils down to, do I want to keep the government or do I want to get rid of them? And therefore, what our attitude is and what we've got to say about the government is of much more interest to them at national elections than it is at the moment about what we say about Labour and how we're different from Labour. Obviously, very different in local elections where we're up against Labour. And, you know, in some parliamentary seats where, you know, there's a real sort of Lib Dem Labour fight. But I think the reason we concentrate so much on that sort of us versus Tories question is that's what's in the public's mind. And in a way, the answer to distinguishing ourselves from Labour is that will require a lot of hard work, but also in a sense will come relatively straightforwardly from, you know, if there is at some point in the future, as is obviously possible, one might even say maybe likely, a Labour Prime Minister. And, you know, in a sense, that's the way that we distinguish ourselves. Just maybe briefly on the DE socio-economic groups, because it gives me a chance to mention my favourite thing to annoy Liberal Democrat activists, which is one of the most popular newspapers with Liberal Democrat voters, sadly, not the Financial Times, but actually the Daily Mail. Now, amongst Liberal Democrat activists, definitely we love the FT. But what it illustrates is, and the reason I mention it in the context of that question, is the importance of getting our message out in media outlets that are not ones we naturally consume ourselves. My guess would be, in the audience, there are probably no regular Daily Mail readers, if this is in any way to put comments. And in that sense, we need to remember we are massively different in some respects from the people who vote for us. And remembering that difference, I think, is the key bit to how we successfully appeal to that wider group of people.
If that takes us somewhat into the other question, Mark. I wonder if I might just press you on that, which is how do you achieve that balance?
Oh yes, of course.
The votes you want to persuade.
Yeah, I mean, I think the again, I think actually it comes back to this point about, for most people, what they're interested in is, are you for the government or against the government? And in a way, the way that we appeal at the moment most effectively to Labour voters in many respects is by making the case about how we are the most effective anti-conservative choice in their area. And that is obviously true in very large parts of the country. Obviously, there are parts of the country where that is a harder case to make at the moment. But I think in those areas where we're having to sort of work harder to win over Labour votes, that overall point that you'll hear it in the media saying, well, our job is to get the Tories out of power. Actually, I think, and certainly chatting to, say, canvassers from Labour-facing areas, is a really effective, helpful bit of background noise. But then what we need to build on that is the relevant local issue, often about how badly run the local council is. And I think that's the combination that works best.
Thank you. Miranda, do you want to pick up this question of how the party can distinguish itself from Labour? Is that enough to be the opposition if you have a Labour Prime Minister? I paraphrase.
I mean, I'm really pleased you've asked me this question, Carys, because it's the most difficult question of all, and to which nobody has an answer. So thank you very much indeed. I mean, clearly, it's a completely different political party with a completely different set of traditions and philosophies. So I'm embarrassed even to be sort of asked the question, but I'm also embarrassed not to have an answer, actually. And I slightly feel that the party should be a little bit embarrassed not to have a great answer at the moment. You know, Mark is absolutely right. You know, the way that our system works, if you're a voter, you have one of two levers to pull. And you either pull the Conservative lever or you pull the Labour or Lib Dem lever, depending on where you live. And that is the most important message to get across. And at the end of 13, well, actually, let's face it, next year it'll be 14 years of Conservative or Conservative-led governments and a generalised feeling of broken Britain. That is the most important factor, you know, facing the electorate. But, you know, I don't know if any of you listened or read about the sort of warnings from the eminent pollster John Curtis earlier in the conference. You know, 11 or 12, 10, 11, 12 in the national polls. Clearly, that's not what matters in the target seats, but you really do need to be getting up above that. You know, and for that, some sort of national distinctive cut-through message is necessary, you know, over and above, please pull this yellow lever in this area. And it is quite tricky at the moment, particularly because one of the things that makes it much more likely that those soft, disillusioned Tories will feel safe to vote Lib Dem is that the Labour leader isn't scary anymore, right? So you haven't got, you know, beastie boy Jeremy Corbyn that you need to keep out of Downing Street. You've got boring Keir Starmer, hooray for boring politicians for once. You know, so it's safe to vote Lib Dem. But therefore, sort of, there's even more of an onus on you know, okay, we all can all agree that, you know, the country's kind of on its knees in many ways. What's getting us up from our knees? What's the positive future? And I think that both from Labour and from the Lib Dems, that's kind of conspicuously lacking. So when you talk to Labour people about this, they say, it's okay, we've got a 3-stage process. 1, detoxify, get rid of the left. 2, reassure the public, because Rachel Reeves is not going to let anybody spend any money on anything at all. And then we'll get to number 3, and that's the kind of country we want to build. It's like, okay, well, when's 3 coming? You know, and I'd like the Lib Dems to sort of give me an indication that there's also, you know, that stage is coming from the Lib Dems as well, the positive case.
Great. If you can pick up the D voter question at the very grateful. How important are they? How do they?
Okay. Can I just answer the Labour question first? Because Miranda says it's so tricky, and it really is. It's like the ultimate question. You are in that sweet spot, as Miranda says. You're in the sweet spot on the Tony Blair, Jeremy Corbyn scale, which is exactly in between Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn. You find Keir Starmer. And I've hardly talked about Keir Starmer today, perhaps for obvious reasons, but let me just talk about him a little bit and how voters see him. They think that he is a flip-flopper. The key swing voters do not like Keir Starmer. They think he flip-flops, and they do not have a strong sense of what he believes in. And they actually, you know, his brand is pretty bad, which I think is good for you, right? So if you want to distinguish yourself from Keir Starmer, then that shouldn't be too difficult, because his brand is fairly bad, and I think there is space there to make that work. Then on to the DE voters. Well, I mean, as Mark says, reach them where they are, find them where they are. I mean, I would say this because I run a public opinion research company, but listen to them. You should do focus groups, you should do opinion polls, always be listening. And when you do listen, I'm sure some of the things you will hear are cost of living, NHS, immigration. These are the issues that drive that DE block to some extent. And the NHS, and the final thing is do what you always do, which is talk about local issues. So always be talking about local hospital, local green spaces. Those things will reach those DE voters, but you've got to keep hammering away, because I mean, this applies to lots and lots of groups of voters, but they are so hard to reach, so low information, that sticking things through the door, I know we all love to do it, but it doesn't cut it.
Thank you very much. So I have more hands. I'll start with the lady in black over here.
What impact do you think Sunaks announcements on the net zero rollback will have in the blue wall seats, both for South East and the South West?
Thank you. And sitting in that area, the gentleman in front there.
Tom, you spoke about Ed Davey needing to be more sort of prominent. If his views on Europe are seen as being ambivalent, ambiguous, how does it help him cut through? Because he will get asked a lot of questions about Europe, and if he doesn't answer the question, how does that make him distinctive?
And just here in the white.
You mentioned briefly about coalitions and all hissed. Were there to be a hung parliament and Labour to offer us full proportional representation at all levels in return for a coalition agreement, what would we respond?
Sounds like think tank you take one. Tom, do you want to start with the question about the ambivalence and Ed becoming more prominent?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, you've hit the nail on the head. I don't think that Ed Davey should go into the 2024 election, for it is going to be 2024, you know, with an ambivalent line on Europe. Now, I mean, my personal view is that he should say something which is simple, kicks the can down the road, and puts the issue on the back burner for that election campaign, because I don't think it's one that you want to be fighting on. But, you know, people, if you sit a focus group down and play them a clip of a politician, I can almost, especially interviews, I can guarantee you the first thing they will say, the voters, and we should always listen to them, what they will say is Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Corbyn, whoever, is not answering the question. And so you do need to answer the question, you need to do it intellectually and literally. But I would obviously try and answer in the process of answering the question, put the issue to one side for the 2024 campaign. It's not where it's going to be won.
Yes.
I've learned now, Carys asks me the worst questions, so I'm going to try and steal the ones you go to Tom. You get a really bad one then. So this question of what to say on Europe obviously is incredibly important because it's so much part of the Lib Dem identity to be the pro-European party. And Brexit is still quite recent, and you know, lots of people joined the party after Brexit because they were so upset about the result and all the rest of it. But it's clearly not where the public are now, and it is not one of their top preoccupations. Obviously, the ways that Brexit has damaged the economy is very important. And so when you have a conversation about the economy, I actually think it's safe to say, well, clearly we have a big problem with our export industry, our manufacturing industry, so we need to give them extra help because of the damage from Brexit. I actually think that's fine to do. But on the question itself, and this question of answering the question. Now, I know obviously Nicola Sturgeon has had this horrific, you know, implosion. But before this horrific implosion, you know, she was an absolute past master of giving the TV viewer confidence that she was listening to the question, taking the concern behind the question seriously, admitting there might be a sort of difference or a tension, and then kind of doing this jiu-jitsu move round to justify her own position. And I think Ed Davey needs to watch loads of tapes of Nicola Sturgeon. I'm not actually joking at all. He needs to watch tapes of Nicola Sturgeon in her heyday saying to the interviewer, yes, this is a problem. We've thought about this and there's a trade-off, and then just this kind of thing. And then all of a sudden you're going, yeah, Nicola, you've taken this really seriously. You've come up with an answer. Wow, amazing. And I think he needs to sort of study that a bit, because you know, he can't pretend that he's not a pro-European. You can't pretend that you wouldn't want to pretend that Lib Dems are not a pro-European party, but it's not where the public is, and no one wants to reopen those divides. So let's not do it.
Fantastic, thank you. So, Mark.
Net zero is the question you want me to answer. Yeah.
Well, I might ask you to answer.
So let's go for net zero first. I mean, I think I find it baffling quite what Rishi Sunak's plan is, because I think if you look at when he initially took over from Liz Truss, there was a definite chunk of voters who were saying they wouldn't vote Conservative, but they quite liked Rishi Sunak. And they were more Remainery. So in a sense, they were a good group of people for the Tories to go after, to try and, for example, see us off in the local elections earlier this year, to do better, you know, against us in by-elections and so on. So, you know, that group that Sunak had the potential to appeal to was very much, in a sense, almost the Lib Dem Tory swing group. And it's like every policy choice he's taken since is to really annoy that group. And so what you've seen is I mean, he still polls slightly better than the Tory party, but it's his ratings have fallen rather than him dragging the Conservative ratings up towards, you know, the higher point that he started at. So I think it's unlikely to be electorally successful for him, though there is an important footnote caveat to that I think we need to remember for ourselves, which is that a lot of people are in favour of action on the environment, think net zero is a good target, and are worried about how to pay their bills next week and next month. And it's as much a tone thing as a policy thing, but we need to respect the fact that people are worried about their personal finances, and therefore the best environmental policies are ones that win over and bring those people with them. And that's one of the mistakes, I think, although obviously it's partly a health issue, not just an environmental issue, mistakes that the Mayor of London has made, was, you know, he's currently consulting on possible new bus routes that might come into force some point next year. It's, I'll beat you up with the tax now, and I might give you some help next year to do your journals instead. That's absolutely the wrong way around of doing it. And that's why Rob, Mayor for London candidates, quite rightly called for a different sort of balance and timing between the carrot and the stick in that sense. And I think I've answered all the questions you wanted me to answer there, haven't I?
But someone's going to have to answer this question. Full PR is on the table. Should the party take it? Maybe a neutral observer.
I think this is not going to be on offer. I have to tell you, it is just not going to be on offer because there's I think what you might get is a Labour government making changes towards PR, maybe for some of the devolved administrations in England, and maybe reintroducing it for London. Who knows? And as there's more English devolution, I think that might be the best you can hope. I just cannot see the Labour Party. There's no appetite for it at all. It's not even part of the Labour conversation at the moment. And then if of course they have a really bad night and they desperately need Lib Dem votes to form a government, you get the terrible problem there is you've got the deathbed conversion of the party that's never shown any interest in it ever before. And how does that go over? Because you don't have to put a huge constitutional change like that to the public. It's just not justifiable to change the voting system without a referendum, I don't think.
And I would just.
It's that their leadership doesn't, and they're not a democratic party.
Let me try and calm hostilities by linking the two issues. So the problem with a lot of these net zero policies is that they haven't been sold to the public, or they've been missold, or they just haven't been given. Public haven't been given any notice at all. They've been kind of hoisted from local authorities or national authorities, and I think you would find exactly the same reaction from the public if you all of a sudden found that the day after the election we were talking about, rather than talking about the cost of living, putting the economy back on track, we were talking about some huge constitutional change, and voters do not care about constitutional changes, I'm afraid to say. So I think you would find the same kind of screeching of brakes on both those issues, and therefore, I would again steer clear unless absolutely necessary.
Great, thank you. So we have about 7 minutes left. So I'm going to ask everyone to keep very brief. This gentleman over here.
Tristan Ward from Sunaks. Can I highly recommend to those thinking about coalition and confidence and supply to read David Law's book on it? It concentrates the mind. Yes. Secondly, you asked about distinguishing us from Labour. We are the party of individuals and letting individuals make themselves their best selves. Labour is a party of sectional interests. This has the advantage of appealing to Conservatives.
Is there a question or is contribution thoughts? Okay. Gentleman in the middle there. Great.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm Tom Deakin from Taunton in Somerset. We saw some numbers from John Curtis the other day about really in the local elections recently, and to some extent the by-elections. Really, we've benefited from a total collapse in the Conservative vote, either voting for someone else or deciding to stay at home. Just wonder what the panel's thoughts are on the risks of those voters returning back to the roost when it comes to a general election. I think it's slightly different in a local election or a by-election to give a protest. How do you feel that what they might do when it really comes to it in a general?
Thank you. And then in the front of here.
So to what extent should policy also be a slogan, especially for campaigning? Getting Brexit done is both a slogan and a policy, whereas for a fair deal, it's kind of an unclear policy and barely a slogan. With the most
and I'll take one more questions.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to take us back a little, if we may, to who those soft Tories are. We've talked about them a lot as key targets in blue wall seats, but it seems we've ended up talking about quite a few of the other groups or other issues instead. In a rural setting,
I'm finding I'm getting better reception from the grandees outside their stately homes than I am in the suburbs around the market towns. That may be just me. when Lord of the Manor says, "Oh, I'm not really interested in this leaflet, but perhaps somebody in the cottages down there might be," I begin to wonder what their current thinking is, and I don't get that reception in the suburbs, as I've said.
So this will probably be our last round, so this will be closing remarks as well. Miranda, I'm going to let you choose which questions you'd like to ask.
Thank you. Will Tory voters go back to the roost on polling day? Which, by the way, I hope is not right at the end of next year, because I mean, I'm up for this, but you know, that's going to be a long haul, isn't it? It's going to be like 1997, God. You know what? It was really important in that landslide win for Tony Blair in 1997, which also brought in this huge rising tide of Lib Dems up to, I think it was 46, wasn't it, Mark? 1997, which was a huge increase in a complementary geographical pattern again. That it was really important, a number of Tory voters who just didn't turn out to vote on the day. And so actually, it's as much their dissatisfaction with the current government and them thinking, okay, we've given them enough rope, you know, let's not give them any more, rather than in some cases persuading them over. I'm sure, and probably this is probably sacrilegious actually to those in the room who are good at the get out the vote you know, operation on the day. But actually, if you can persuade enough Tory voters that they really shouldn't let their team have any more chances, that's, I think in 97, I think the stay-at-home Tory vote was it even, I think it was larger than the voters who switched Tory to Labour in some, certainly in some places. So, you know, it's very important, just their general sense of dissatisfaction, which people do say they're picking up on the doorstep. So yeah, Tories stay at home rather than go back to the roost. I don't think they will go back to the roost. I mean, Matthew Paris wrote a strange column saying he hates everything about this government, but he thinks Rishi's a nice man, so he's going to vote Tory, even though he's campaigning against everything they've done for about the last 10 years. But let's hope there aren't too many. You know.
I'm going to answer the same question because I think it's the key question. It's the most important question. So if you look at public opinion polls, things that are out there now, you'll see that of that 2019 Conservative vote, half of them are saying they're going to vote Conservative and the other half are saying something else. And of that something else group, about a third are saying they either don't know or would not vote. And that is the key group. So whoever asked this question has put their finger on something really important. And I think, as Miranda says, I don't think they're automatically going to come home as they have in previous elections, for several reasons. One, voters have become incredibly transactional and really, really not attached to any particular party. And second and related is that the kind of people who switched into that Conservative coalition, who are now saying they wouldn't vote Conservative and they don't know or wouldn't vote, they're not natural Tories. They're people who voted for Boris Johnson and get Brexit done because they thought it was, you know, a desperate national crisis that needed to be solved, and they hated Jeremy Corbyn. And the final thing is, you know, the thing to watch out for. So, I mean, I'm not saying for absolute certain this group isn't coming home, because they could, but the thing to watch out for is, what is the reason? At the moment, there is no reason that they would come home. There's nothing to scare them enough about Keir Starmer. Even though they don't like him, in a forced choice, they will always choose Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak. They don't like Keir Starmer. They think his brand's terrible. But what is it that is going to, you know, really be the squeeze message on the day that the Conservatives use to bring those voters home? I think, judging by this conference, lots of you are really worried that there is something out there. There's kind of a like Conservative silver bullet they're going to use to bring these people back to the polls. It's not there yet. We'll see what they come up with in the next year.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So let's think. So slogans, yeah. The weird thing about slogans, political slogans, is the most successful ones basically break every rule that you might think applies to what makes a slogan good or not. So that, to give just one example, Barack Obama slogan, hope. Really successful, but my goodness, you could absolutely trash it by saying, well, it's vague, it doesn't tell you what it's about, everyone's in favour of it. Yeah, so there's something really weird about political slogans that I think rarely are successful because of the exact language itself,
yes,
but are rather successful because they capture, in a sense, a broader feeling. And that's why, although hope, in a sense, one could completely rubbish as being vague, but of course, everyone's in favour of hope. And what does it tell you? It's work because it captures what a broader mood. And I think that's what the fair deal slogan does, is it captures that sense of things are just broken and are wrong and are run unsuccessfully, that there is an innate unfairness. There is an innate unfairness in how Britain is run. There's an unfairness in the way our economy operates. There's an unfairness in the way our society is structured, and there's an unfairness in the way that our politics operate. And that is a really powerful, I think that is a really powerful message. And I would just give one example of its use in the past by us, because lots of us, for lots of really good reasons, look back with a fair degree of fondness and also maybe a little bit of degree of envy at the electoral success of the time of Charles Kennedy's time as Lib Dem leader. What was the central word in both of his general election campaigns? It was fairness. It worked phenomenally well then. And so I absolutely get that, you know, people, just as one could, as it were, rubbish hope, one could sort of say, well, aren't there these problems with fairness? But I think it really hits both the right public mood, but also we should take confidence from how well that's worked for us in the past. And just very briefly then, on a couple of the other points, because I know we're nearly out of time, on the point about the soft conservatives, and so, I mean, there's this slightly tongue-in-cheek phrase I use, but I think has a degree of truth about it, that there is this group of people who basically live in bigger houses but have bigger potholes. You know, big houses, but bigger potholes outside their houses. By which I mean there is this group of people who would have traditionally been pretty solidly conservative, maybe actually a bit attracted to Tony Blair in his heyday, and who would generally have been relatively insulated from, due to their prosperity, previous government failings, problems with economy, etc. But now, even they are finding that there is that physical manifestation of what is going wrong in the country impacting their lives. And that's why sewage is such a powerful symbol of that. And then just finally on books, actually the David Laws book I would most recommend is his one about Lord Kitchener and about all of the fake news that circulated around Lord Kitchener's death during the First World War. It is an absolutely fascinating tale of how pre-internet, all of the things that we worry now about fake news and Donald Trump and people, you know, grifters circulating false stories to try to make money out of it. All of that is captured in the stories around Lord Kitchener's death. So I would really recommend David's book on that, as well as obviously some of his other books too.
Fantastic. So we'll have a recommendation to take away. We'll draw to a close there because we're out of time. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really fascinating and fun discussion as well. And huge thanks to all of our speakers for their time and their contributions. Thank you.